Hello, I'm Dr. Sherry, author of the Cruise Through History Stories for Travelers. And today I want to take you on a virtual tour through one of the stories in Itinerary 5 from Arabia across the southern Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And that is at the port of Malta. Malta, closer to Africa than to Europe, and yet very individual from either of the coasts. It was desired by Napoleon and by Hitler. It was at the crossroads of ancient history. The Carthaginians fought here. And this is a place where eventually the Knights of St. John came when they were homeless. And so the story of Malta goes back very far into antiquity. Now, the most important person in the history of Malta to all the Maltese is the Apostle Paul, or as they say, Paul. In 60 of this era, he came ashore. Actually, he was shipwrecked on an island off the coast, northern coast of Malta, and he was helped into a cave in what is now Rabat. And in Rabat, there is the Church of St. Paul. Across the roadway today, there is the walled medieval city of Medina. Medina was the medieval capital of Malta. So you had the farmers in Rabat who went to the Church of St. Paul. And you had eventually, when there was a bishop, you had the Cathedral of St. Paul right across the roadway in the opulent city of Medina. But when the Knights came, they thought that Medina was too far inland to be a defensible capital. The Knights preferred to remain on the coast. And the Maltese were just as happy to have the Knights be as far away as they might be, because as the Maltese told the Knights, they were Catholic forever, and they didn't need the Knights to tell them how to be good Catholics. Now, the Knights have their own history, and I should bring you up to date with that. In 1085, the Knights were formed as the Order of St. John Hospitallers. That means that they gave hospitality or safe harbor to the pilgrims in Jerusalem, or north of Jerusalem when they were pushed further out into the northern community of Acre. And that's how they began. And it was in 1291 when the Ottoman Turks took over the area of the Holy Land and pushed the Knights off to the sea. The Knights needed a home, and they ended up in Rhodes. And it was on the island of Rhodes that they built another walled city with a grand palace for the Grand Master and all of the tongues, the individual orders of the Knights. There are actually 8 tongues. Each of the tongues literally speak a different language. English, Italian, German, French, and some variations of Spanish, because Catalonian. And so each of the tongues had a separate home, as though they were a separate subchapter of the Order of St. Knights. But in 1526 came the Ottoman Turks again. And in a great battle in defense of Rhodes, once again, the Knights were homeless, and they appealed to the Pope. And the Pope appealed to the very Catholic King of Spain, Charles V. Now, at that time, in the early 16th century, Spain controlled Malta, as it did Sicily. In fact, the whole southern part of what we know today as Italy, that part below the Papal lands, were controlled by either Spain or France. At this time, it was controlled by Spain. So the Pope asked Charles, King Charles V. If you're a good Catholic, please do my bidding and find a home for the Order of St. John. And this rock that was Malta meant very little to the king, and so he bestowed that home on the knights. Here you are, make a home on Malta. And the knights did. They once again built a walled city, and they built 3 forts: Fort St. Elmo, Fort St. Angelo, and Fort St. Michael. And these forts were arranged around the Sybaris Peninsula and a grand harbor. So the knights had what they desired most, and that was literally a safe harbor protected by their forts for their ships, because the Mediterranean at this time was really an Ottoman lake. The Ottoman Turks controlled the Holy Land and the Eastern Mediterranean. They controlled roads. They were literally sweeping across the eastern portion of the Mediterranean, headed west toward Hungary, and that resulted in what is generally regarded as holy wars. But in actuality, it was about commerce. It was about control of the Mediterranean. And the Ottoman Turkish ships looted Spanish treasure ships as they came back with gold from the New World. And since the King of Spain was the benefactor of the knights, on the behalf of their benefactor, and in fact to loot for their own benefit, the Knights of St. John were very efficient sailors. And so it was really a war of commerce in the Mediterranean between the Ottoman Turks and the Knights of St. John. Once again, having pushed the knights from the Holy Land, having pushed the knights from Rhodes, the Ottoman Turks found the knights to be an irritant in their midst. And so in 1565, once again, there was a great battle. And the Ottoman Turkish naval captains came to lay a siege on the grand harbor of Malta. This is where the knights, held up in their 3 forts, defended their turf. Now, it was at this time the sort of practice when you prevailed upon the navy of another to take their captains as slaves, because there were rowed galleons and that's how the ships were manned. And the commander of the Sultan's navy, one Barbosa, Hayreddin Barbosa, known as Redbeard, had actually been a slave on a ship of the knights and later was freed by his compatriots in a later raid between the ships. Barbosa, at this point, had retired to a villa in Capri, and his successor, Dragou, was now the leader, the commander of the Sultan's navy. And Dragou had once kept one Valetta, a French member of the Order of Knights, and had defeated him in a sea battle, and he was once the prisoner. And Valetta was able to free himself, and at this point, in 1565, Valetta was the Grand Master of the Order of the Knights of St. John in Malta, and Dragou was commander of the Sultan's navy. And once again they met in a grand battle in the Grand Harbor in Malta. And this was the great battle where the Ottoman Turks scaled the walls of Fort St. Elmo. And the knights, who were really men who preferred to lead religious functions and tend to the sick and give harbor to pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land, and yet when it came down to it, they were wonderful warriors. And when at one point the naval captains were able to blow a hole in the walls of Fort St. Elmo, The Grand Master was there fighting back and swordplay in a narrow space. And today, if you go to Malta and you go into Fort St. Elmo, you'll see where there were holes blasted in the walls and where the knights made their last stand in the fort, in the chapel there within the fort. But there were 3 forts on the harbor. And so at the end of the day, or actually in several months of fighting, the Knights of St. John were able to maintain their hold on Malta. And in 1571, they rebuilt their city. And they named it for their victorious Grand Master Valetta, and they called it Valetta. And this is the city that we visit today, with the restored walls of Fort St. Elmo, Fort St. Angelo, and Fort St. Michael ringing the Grand Harbor. We are able to walk the streets of this city. But what I want to draw your attention to is one particular building in the middle of Valetta, and that is the Co-Cathedral of St. John. This was the Church of the Knights that was under construction from 1604 to about 1608. Actually, they started in 1571, but around 1604, they had it in a very fine spot, and they were ready to consecrate various aspects. The nave was completed, and there were little side chapels, and each of the side chapels was devoted to one of the tongues. Now, this was under Valetta. It was a rather simple place. But in the 1660s, a later of the knights, of the Grand Masters of the Knights, decided that this should be a more opulent church. I mean, St. Peter's is larger, and there are churches that have far more religious significance. But in terms of opulence, there is no more opulent church in the world than the Co-Cathedral of St. John in Valetta, Malta. But before I end this little virtual tour of Malta, before we exit the Co-Cathedral, I should tell you 2 things. First of all, how did it become the Co-Cathedral? Well, in about 1800, the Bishop of Malta, in the Cathedral of St. Paul in Medina, and the Church of St. Paul in Rabat that sits on top of St. Paul's original cave, and the catacombs that eventually developed around St. Paul. And the home of a bishop or an archbishop is always a cathedral. And if the bishop decides to have sort of a second home, that place becomes the Co-Cathedral. So the Bishop of Medina, sitting in his lovely cathedral in Medina, looked over at the Church of St. John, far more opulent, and he decided that should be his second home. So it became the Co-Cathedral of St. John. But before you exit, you must step into the oratorio, the oratory of the church. And there are 2 paintings in this church for you to really gaze upon. In 1604, even though the church itself was to be kept simple, the Grand Master at the time, Wignacourt, knew of the art of Caravaggio, and he wanted this artist to paint for him. And the knight, well, Caravaggio, a man who was a brilliant painter with a terrible temper, had once again disgraced himself and was forced to leave Rome. And Caravaggio thought if he became one of the Knights of St. John, then the Pope would certainly give him dispensation for any murders that he committed and restore his ability to return to Rome. It was all about returning to Rome. And Wignacourt, Grand Master Wignacourt, thought with this man who wants to be a knight, how wonderful to have him paint the beheading of St. John for the oratory of the Church of St. John in the home of the Knights in Valetta, Malta. And indeed, Caravaggio did install this painting in 1608 in the oratory. And it is the only painting known of Caravaggio where he signed the work. In fact, it is signed in blood. If you look very closely, you'll see that the blood of St. John, as he is being beheaded, becomes the signature of Caravaggio. Now, Caravaggio was not present when the painting was unveiled on the saint's day in 1608 because he had become involved in yet another misdeed and he was being held prisoner in St. Angelo. So the unveiling went on without him. For today, we'll leave the Co-Cathedral of St. John in the midst of Valetta, Malta. So many more stories in Malta that we will also leave for another day. And you can read all the stories of Itinerary 5 and of the Knights of St. John in other itineraries as well, and their escapades in the Holy Land and in Rhodes, in other of the Cruise Through History storybooks. So join me again for a virtual tour, read the storybooks, or hopefully I may see you in the future as we cruise the world and I tell stories on ships. Until then, be well.